Welcome to another deep dive. And philosopher, this one is really going to get you thinking. We're going deep on personal identity, like what makes you you over time? And how does that connect to like how we should act, ethics?
Yeah. It's a fundamental question, right? I mean, for philosophers, figuring out what the self is and how it persists,
Right.
well, that has some pretty big implications for ethical theory and just thinking about how we make moral decisions every day.
Absolutely. So for this deep dive, we're going to be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on personal identity and ethics. It's a pretty dense source, so we'll try to break down those key arguments. How do these abstract ideas about the self actually play out in like real world ethical
It's
situations?
going to be fascinating to see those connections.
Totally. So where do we even begin with this whole identity and ethics thing? When did philosophers first start making those connections?
Well, even way back in ancient philosophy, you see thinkers grappling with this link between identity and, well, we could call it self-interest. Like Plato, he believed in an immaterial soul. It was basically defined by being alive.
So like a part of you that survives after death.
Right. And that idea gave him a reason to think we should care about what happens after we die. Because it's still like the same you experiencing it, that enduring soul.
So identity, that stable self, was already being used to justify thinking about the future, even a future beyond, our physical bodies.
Exactly. Now, contrast that with, say, Lucretius.
Okay, how did he see it?
Well, he was also all about anticipating future experiences, but he totally rejected the idea of anything after death. Because for him, you are a combo of body and soul, totally inseparable.
So even if there's a soul, it's meaningless without the body, like it wouldn't be your experiences.
Right. So both these guys, Plato and Lucretius, they both saw identity as like super important for thinking about the future. But they had this fundamental disagreement about what that identity actually was.
It's so interesting, right? Even back then, they recognized that identity played a big role in how we view our own self-interest, even if they totally disagreed on what constitutes that identity.
And the fascinating thing is, both of them just took for granted that identity was the basis for caring about your own future. The debate wasn't about if it mattered, but what made up that identity. And that sets the stage for more uh, direct connections to ethics later on.
Okay, so speaking of more explicit links to ethics, our source points to John Locke as a key figure here. What did he bring to the table?
Oh, Locke. He's the one who really brought this idea of a person as a forensic term into the spotlight.
A forensic term.
Yeah, think of it like a concept that's tied up with all those norms around moral agency and accountability. For Locke, a person, it's not just any being, it's an intelligent being that can, like, understand laws and experience happiness and suffering. And because of that, they can be held responsible for their actions.
So right there, he's connecting who a person is over time to all these moral implications.
Totally. He took personal identity from being this abstract metaphysical puzzle and made it super relevant to how we think about morality and even legal systems. And for Locke, the key to personal identity was consciousness, specifically how consciousness extends through memory.
Okay, so walk me through that.
Basically, he said person Y at some time is the same as person X at an earlier time if and only if Y's consciousness can be traced back to include X's thoughts and experiences,
Yeah.
usually through remembering them.
So if I remember doing something in the past, that past self who did it is basically like me, according to Locke.
Yeah, that's the gist. And this has big implications for, like, caring about your future selves. It makes sense to be concerned about what happens to you in the future, good or bad, because your consciousness extends to that future you.
It's like there's a thread connecting those different versions of yourself.
Right. And the same goes for moral responsibility. You're accountable for actions you remember doing because those actions were done by, you. Like, think about how Locke viewed the afterlife. It would only make sense to be, like, excited or scared about an afterlife if there was a being whose consciousness connected back to your present consciousness.
So it's not just about whether a soul or a body persists, it's about this continuity of consciousness.
Exactly. But of course, there were some big objections to Locke's view. Our source mentions Butler and Reed.
Yeah, what did they have to say?
Well, they both pushed back pretty hard against Locke's relational view of identity. They were more into the substance-based idea. Like, Butler's main point was that consciousness, it doesn't create identity. It actually presupposes it.
So, like, you can only remember your own experiences. The act of remembering doesn't make it yours. It just shows that it already was.
You got it. And Reed chimed in on that too, but he also pointed out that consciousness is always changing, right? So how can something so fluid be the foundation for something as seemingly stable as personal identity?
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like our thoughts and feelings are constantly in flux. How can that be the basis for a consistent self?
And they're also worried about what this meant for moral responsibility. Like, if identity is so flimsy, how can we hold people accountable for their past actions or even care about our own future selves?
Right. If who we are is that changeable, it seems like our whole system of, rewards and punishments falls apart. And even planning for the future seems kind of pointless.
Butler was pretty blunt about it. He basically said that if Locke was right, then caring about our future selves is just self-deception because they're basically different people.
Ouch.
Huh.
So Locke was basically saying that our existing practices already fit with his view. Like he pointed out that we don't hold people responsible for actions they did while insane.
Yeah, he was trying to show that his ideas weren't totally out there. But Butler and Reed, well, they kind of misinterpreted Locke. They thought he was saying that we're just these, like, momentary blips of consciousness, no real persistence at all.
But Locke's actual view was more nuanced, right? Like, it was about a specific relationship maintained through consciousness, not just like moment to moment sameness.
Exactly. He wasn't saying your consciousness at one time is literally identical to your consciousness later. It was about a connection, specifically memory,
Yeah.
linking those different times.
Okay, so even though Butler and Reed's initial interpretation was a bit off, their concerns about memory already assuming identity, and the problem of like if A remembers B and B remembers C, it doesn't mean A remembers C.
Transitivity.
Transitivity and the whole thing about persisting even if you have amnesia, those are still big challenges for a strictly lock-in account. So how have contemporary philosophers tried to deal with those limitations?
Well, they've taken Locke's basic insights, especially in what's called the psychological view, and they've tried to refine them. Like, to tackle Butler's worry about remembering already assuming it's my past, philosophers came up with quasi-memory. It's often called cue memory.
Cue memory, so what's that?
It's like a memory, but you don't have to assume it happened to you. You just remember an experience happening to someone. And that memory was caused in the right way by the original experience.
So it broadens the scope of what's relevant to identity beyond just like remembering my own personal past.
Right. And then there's Reed's issue about transitivity. If A remembers B and B remembers C, it doesn't automatically mean A remembers C. To deal with that, the psychological view emphasizes the continuity of these cue memories.
Okay, so like chains of connected memory.
Exactly. It's like overlapping chains linking different stages of a life. So maybe an old general doesn't directly remember stealing apples as a kid, but he remembers being a young officer who remembers the apple stealing incident. There's a chain of connection.
Makes sense. But what about amnesia? Like we still feel like the same person even if we lose some memories?
Yeah, good point. So to account for that, these contemporary views get in other psychological stuff beyond memory, like your intentions, your beliefs and values, your goals, even your personality. All of that contributes to what they call psychological continuity and connectedness.
So it's not just memory, it's this whole like web of psychological stuff that defines who we are.
Right. It's a much richer picture. So the psychological criterion of personal identity, as it's understood now, basically says that you at one time are the same person as you at a later time if there's this unique psychological continuity between you.
Unique. Why unique?
Because you can imagine scenarios where your psychology splits. That's actually going to come up later.
Interesting. Okay, so we've got the psychological view, all updated from Locke's ideas, but our source also talks about the biological view. What's the motivation for that one?
So a lot of the push for the biological view comes from thinking about our essence. Like, what is it that makes us us? We have all these psychological traits, beliefs, memories, but none of that seems to really capture what we fundamentally are.
It's like there's a meanness that goes beyond any particular thought or feeling.
Right. And the psychological criterion seems to imply that our essence is just being a person with all those psychological capacities. But, thinkers like Olson have pointed out that we weren't always persons. Like, we were infants once, even fetuses. We didn't have all that complex psychology back then.
So were we not ourselves back then?
Exactly. And what if someone ends up in a vegetative state? We still think of them as the same person, even though all that higher-level psychology is gone. So the biological view says that our essence is actually being the same living organism. That's what stays constant throughout our lives.
So as long as it's the same biological entity, it's the same me, no matter what happens to my psychology.
That's the idea. Now, the thing is, while that might fit with some of our ethical intuitions, it doesn't really explain why we have those intuitions. Like, sure, I might continue to exist as this biological being, But is that really what makes me care about my future?
Like, it doesn't really explain why we feel that personal connection to our future selves,
Wow.
right?
Yeah. It seems like our prudential concerns, like caring about what happens to us, are more tied to those psychological links we expect to have with our future selves.
So maybe the biological view tells us who persists, but not why that persistence matters to us personally.
Right, and that leads to another idea, which is often associated with the biological view, that biological continuity is what preserves our actual identity, but psychological continuity is what makes us care about that identity. And that opens the door to the whole identity doesn't matter view.
Identity doesn't matter. We'll have to unpack that one. But first, what about the narrative view? Our source talks about that too, and it seems like a pretty big shift.
It is. The narrative view, which people like Sheckman and McIntyre champion, it kind of moves away from that classic question of what makes a person at one time the same as a person at another time, and focuses more on under what conditions do all these experiences and actions really belong to a specific person.
So it's less about pinpointing a strict identity and more about like figuring out what truly belongs to my life story.
Yeah, exactly. And part of the reason for this shift is that the traditional theories of identity run into all sorts of problems. But the other part is that this characterization question fits better with how we think about things in our everyday lives. Like when we ask ourselves, why do I care about my future? Or why am I responsible for what I did in the past? The narrative view says the answer is all about whether those things fit into the story of my life.
It's like we're constantly writing and revising our own identities through the stories we tell ourselves.
Right. And that narrative, it gives meaning to our lives and
Uh,
helps us understand why certain things are truly ours.
So this narrative unity, this coherent life story, that's what makes us care about ourselves and our future.
Yeah. Like it makes sense to anticipate the future because those future experiences will become part of my ongoing story. And I'm concerned about myself because I'm this like extended narrative ego. And I'm responsible for my actions because they flow from the values and beliefs that make up my life story.
It's a really compelling way of looking at it. But our source does point out one potential issue. It seems like narrative identity still needs some kind of underlying identity to work. Like, there needs to be a subject, a me, who's experiencing all this and weaving it into a story.
That's a really good point. If you need a pre-existing numerically identical self to have a coherent life story, then the narrative view doesn't completely solve the problem of identity, kind of kicks the can back to those challenges faced by the psychological and biological views.
Right. So while it's a cool way of thinking about identity and how it connects to our lives, it might not be the final answer. What about this anthropological view that our source mentions? I'm not as familiar with that one.
The anthropological view, it's mainly associated with Maria Scheckman, and it comes from this idea that the psychological and biological views don't fully explain how we treat people at the edges of life, like infants, fetuses, people in vegetative states.
What's the issue with those views in those cases?
Well, the psychological criterion, it focuses on things like memory and self-awareness,
Hmm.
stuff that infants and people in vegetative states don't really have. And the biological criterion, while it includes those individuals as living beings, it doesn't really explain why we see them as connected to their past or future selves, or why they deserve care and respect.
So it's not just about being the same organism, it's about being seen as part of this like human life cycle, part of a community.
Exactly. The anthropological view says that we're humans embedded in these social ways of life, and our identity is tied up with that whole human experience.
Mhm.
Not just our biology or psychology, but also the things we learn, the roles we play, how we're treated by others.
So identity is about being on this path to becoming a full member of society.
Yeah, like from infant to adult, it's all part of this bigger picture. And that helps explain why we consider people with disabilities or in vegetative states as like still one of us. They're still part of this web of human relationships and concerns.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, this identity doesn't matter view, that's a bold statement. What's the argument there?
So the IDM view is most famously associated with Derek Parfit. He was all about this idea called reductionism.
Mm.
Basically, he said, personal identity isn't this deep, mysterious thing that exists apart from all the psychological connections we have throughout our lives. He called all those connections relation R.
Relation R.
Yeah. It's like the thread that connects different stages of our lives. And he used this thought experiment about splitting yourself to make his point.
Oh, right, the fission thing.
Yeah, imagine you split into two people, each with all your memories, your personality, everything. Now, if identity is one-to-one, then you can't be identical to both of them. but they both seem to have everything that matters for surviving something. So Parfit's argument is that since everything we care about is preserved in both individuals, even though they're not numerically identical to the original you, then maybe identity itself isn't what's important.
So it's not about staying the same singular individual. It's about those connections continuing, even if they split or branch out.
Exactly. And that has some big implications for how we think about rationality. Like
Like,
if those psychological connections weaken over time, maybe it's actually rational to care less about our distant future selves.
whoa, that's like saying it's okay to be less concerned about our future.
Well, it's more nuanced than that, but yeah, it challenges how we usually think about caring about our future.
Hmm.
So how do all these different views of identity hold up when we throw fission into the mix?
Yeah. It seems like a real test for those theories.
For sure. Like the psychological criterion, with its focus on unique psychological continuity, it obviously has a problem with fission because you end up with two people who are psychologically continuous with the original.
So it breaks down in that case.
Yeah. And the biological criterion, well, some people who hold that view might just go all in on identity. Doesn't matter. They'd say, sure, biological identity is real, but it's not what matters. What matters is this same-person relation that allows for branching.
So they'd kind of side with Parfit in a way. What about the anthropological view?
Sheckman, she argues that what happens after fission would depend on the social context. Like if fission was super rare, those two survivors might be seen as one of us, still human, but not numerically identical to the original person because their relationships would be so different.
Like they'd have two sets of spouses and friends and all that.
Exactly. But if fission became super common, then maybe our whole concept of a person would change. So even with fission, she's trying to keep that connection between identity and how we treat each other.
It seems like a lot of this boils down to whether you take a first-person perspective, like what matters to me personally, or a third-person perspective, like how others would see those fission products.
Yeah, and those two perspectives might not always agree. Our source even suggests they might be irreconcilable. So how we view what it means to be a person really shapes how we interpret these thought experiments.
Okay, so we've got all these views on the table. Our source also briefly mentions non-reductionist views, like the soul theory and four-dimensionalism. How do those fit into this whole identity and ethics thing?
So non-reductionist views, they say that identity is about something deeper than just our psychology or biology. Like the soul theory says there's this immaterial soul that's the real berry of identity. It stays the same even if our bodies and minds change.
It's like this unchanging essence that makes us who we are.
Right. But the problem with that is like, how do we even know if we had the same soul over time? We can't see it or measure it. And even if it's true, if it's completely untraceable, does it really matter for how we live our lives?
Yeah, it seems like it wouldn't have much impact on our everyday decisions and relationships.
Exactly. Our source contrasts that with the anthropological view, which is grounded in observable social facts. Then there's four-dimensionalism, which is a really trippy idea. It's a type of reductionism, but it tries to hold on to the importance of identity, even with things like fission.
Okay, remind me what four-dimensionalism is again.
It says that objects, including people, have temporal parts. Like we exist not just at one point in time, but as these extended beings throughout time. So with fission, both those new individuals were always part of the same, like, four-dimensional space-time worm.
So they're still connected in this weird, timey-wimey way.
Yeah. But even then, the question is, does that really matter to us? Like, if I'm somehow connected to a future self that's totally different from me, does that bare fact of identity really mean anything if there's no psychological connection?
It seems like even with these more out there views, that tension between what identity is and what truly matters to us keeps popping up. Now, our source goes on to talk about prudential and moral units. What's the key point there?
Well, the main point is that just because we figure out some metaphysical definition of identity, that doesn't automatically tell us what's ethically important. What we really need is to figure out the units that matter for ethical decision-making. Like, who is the "my" in self-interest? Who is the agent that's responsible for actions?
So it's about figuring out who or what counts in our ethical calculations.
Exactly. And then there's the whole question of how identity plays into different ethical theories.
Okay, so how has identity been used to support different ethical frameworks?
Well, one big area is using it to bolster consequentialism, especially utilitarianism. One way they do that is by challenging Rawls' idea of the separateness of persons.
Remind me what that is.
Rawls argued that we need to respect the distinctness of individuals. Like, we can't just treat everyone's interests as one big pool to be maximized. But Parfit, with his identity doesn't matter view, argued that if we're not really distinct, separate selves in this deep metaphysical sense, then maybe Rawls is wrong.
So if our individual identities are kind of fuzzy, then maybe utilitarianism isn't so bad.
That's the idea. But our source points out that it depends on what kind of reductionism you're talking about. Like, are we talking about momentary experiences or enduring selves or full-fledged persons? The most extreme version, which says that only momentary experiences exist, that's the one that fits best with utilitarianism.
But that raises a whole other issue, right? Like, how can a momentary experience have interests and goals? That's what we usually base our ethics on.
Yeah, that's a problem. So some philosophers, like Brink, have explored this idea that maybe even egoists could become consequentialists if you take psychological continuity into account.
Egoists, like people who only care about themselves.
Right. But the idea is that if what counts as one's own extends beyond the individual to include anyone you're psychologically connected to, then an egoist might actually have reason to care about the well-being of everyone they're connected to.
So egoism could lead to, like, universal concern. That's a wild thought.
Yeah.
And our source mentions a connection between reductionism and contractualism, too.
Yeah, the argument is that if psychological connectedness is what matters, then maybe we could extend that idea of justifiability beyond just our own future selves. Like maybe we should also make sure our actions are justifiable to anyone we're connected to.
So it's like a social contract based on those psychological links.
Right. And then there's the whole question of using biological identity to think about compensation. Like if someone's harmed early in life, before they develop all those psychological capacities, should they still be compensated?
Like in cases of fetal alcohol syndrome.
Exactly. If we think they should be compensated, it might suggest that the relevant unit for thinking about harm is the biological being, not just the psychologically continuous person.
So different aspects of our identity might be more relevant for different ethical questions.
Yeah, and that gets to what our source calls the problem of multiplicity. Maybe there's not just one way of understanding identity that's good for all ethical situations.
That's an important point to keep in mind. Okay, let's talk about moral responsibility. Locke connected it pretty directly to identity, but is that still the common view?
Well, most philosophers today wouldn't say that identity is all you need for moral responsibility. There are things that can excuse you even if you're the same person who did the action. But they generally agree that identity is at least a necessary condition. Like, you can't be responsible for something someone else did.
Right, that seems pretty basic. But then our source goes on to show how all these different criteria of identity can have problems when we try to use them for figuring out responsibility.
Yeah, like memory.
Yeah.
You might remember something someone else did. Or you might forget something you did, but still be responsible for it. And biological continuity isn't perfect either. What about brain transplants? Maybe psychological continuity is what matters in those cases.
And then there are things like fugue states, where someone's identity seems to temporarily split.
Right, and even psychological continuity has issues. Like, what if someone's personality gradually changes? Are they still responsible for things they did before they changed? So a lot of contemporary philosophers are focusing more on this idea of characterization.
Characterization.
Yeah, it's about whether an action really fits with someone's values and character. Like Checkman says, it's about whether the action flows from their narrative identity.
But then we're back to the fission problem, aren't we? If a bank robber splits into two people, and both of them remember planning the robbery, are they both responsible?
Exactly. It gets tricky. Four-dimensionalism tries to solve this by saying they were both always there as part of the original person. But that has some weird implications. Like, maybe what I refers to depends on what happens in the future.
That's getting pretty meta.
Yeah. And then the reductionist view might just say, look, identity isn't strictly necessary for responsibility. What matters is psychological continuity. So maybe both those fission products are responsible.
It seems like fission really forces us to rethink how we view the link between identity and responsibility. What about the anthropological view? What does it say?
It focuses less on finding the precise criteria for responsibility and more on understanding who we hold accountable in our society. Like, it's about the social norms around blame and punishment.
Okay, so it's more about the social context than the metaphysics of identity. Now, let's jump into applied ethics. Our source talks about embryonic research and abortion as areas where identity really matters.
For sure. Like with embryonic stem cell research, one argument against it is that embryos are already human beings, so they have a right to life. But people who challenge that view often bring up twinning.
Twinning.
Yeah, like when a single embryo splits into two identical twins. If that happens, what happened to the original human being? It raises all sorts of questions about when a human life begins.
It's like a real-life version of fission, and it makes you wonder if we should really consider every embryo as a separate individual with full moral status.
Right. And then there's abortion. There's this famous argument against abortion called the future like ours argument. It basically says that abortion is wrong because it deprives the fetus of a future filled with valuable experiences.
But that seems to assume that the fetus already has an identity, a sense of self that's connected to that future.
Yeah, and some philosophers have argued that fetuses, especially early on, don't have that kind of personal identity yet. They haven't developed the psychological capacities to be connected to a future self.
But couldn't you say that person is just a phase, like being a student? Like the fetus and the later child are still the same individual, even if they're not a person yet?
That's the counter-argument. But then we're back to fission. If I split into two people, both of them would have valuable futures, even if I as a single individual don't survive. So maybe the problem with abortion isn't just about losing a numerical identity, but about losing those potential experiences.
It seems like these applied ethical dilemmas really push us to clarify what we mean by identity. Our source also talks about advanced directives, especially in cases of dementia. How does identity play into that?
Well, with advanced directives, you have someone making a decision about their future care while they're still competent. But then if they develop dementia, their mental state changes. So the question is, should we follow the wishes of that past self, or should we prioritize the well-being of the present self, even if they're not the same psychologically?
Yeah, it's like who gets to decide? The past self who is more cognitively intact, or the present self who might have different needs and preferences?
Exactly. If we think psychological continuity is really important, then maybe we should go with the past self's wishes. But if we think that even a cognitively impaired person still has some level of autonomy, then maybe we should prioritize their present well-being.
It's a tough call. And our source also mentions other applied ethics issues like dissociative identity disorder and genetic interference.
Yeah, DD really makes you question what it means to be a single self. Like, if someone has distinct alters, are they different people? And genetic interference raises the question of whether changing a fetus's genes changes their identity. It's like, are we preventing a different person from coming into existence?
These are some deep questions. Okay, finally, our source talks about alternative approaches to thinking about identity and ethics. Like, instead of trying to figure out identity first and then applying it to ethics, maybe we should do it the other way around.
Yes, some philosophers think our ethical commitments should inform how we think about identity. Like Korsgaard, she has this Kantian view where she says that being a moral agent requires us to see ourselves as unified over time. It's a practical necessity for making decisions and holding ourselves accountable.
So it's like we need to believe in a unified self in order to function in the world, even if we don't fully understand how that works metaphysically.
Exactly. And communitarians, like McIntyre, they say that we understand ourselves through our communities and traditions. And for them, narrative unity, being able to see our lives as a coherent story, that's essential for being a responsible person.
But our source points out that not everyone's life feels like a coherent story. Maybe that's more of an ideal than a reality for some people.
That's a good point. Then there's Rovain, who says we should start with an ethical concept of personhood and build our theory of identity from there.
So, like, figure out what makes someone morally significant and then define identity based on that.
Yeah. And her view leads to some really interesting ideas, like the possibility of group persons. And then there's Johnston, who's a minimalist about identity. He basically says the specific facts about personal identity don't really matter for justifying our basic practices, like caring about ourselves.
So it doesn't matter what self is. We're justified in looking out for our own well-being regardless.
Right. But the question is, can that minimalist approach work for all ethical issues? Like, what about responsibility and compensation?
It seems like there's a lot more to explore there. So after this whirlwind tour of identity and ethics, what are the big takeaways?
Well, our source concludes that there's no easy answer to the question of how identity relates to ethics. There are just too many different views of identity, too many different ethical concerns, and it's not clear which one should take priority.
And it's not even clear if there's one single relationship between them, right?
Yeah, maybe it's more complex than that. So instead of trying to find one grand unifying theory, maybe we should focus on specific ethical questions and see how different aspects of identity play into them. Like, Maybe psychological continuity matters more for thinking about our future selves, while biological identity matters more for questions of harm and compensation.
It's like what it means to be you might depend on the specific ethical context.
Exactly. And that's something to think about, philosopher. How does this idea of a pluralistic self, with different aspects being relevant in different situations, how does that change how you view your own ethical commitments?
That's a great question to leave our listeners with. So, philosopher, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a wild ride through all the twists and turns of personal identity and its connections to ethics. I encourage you to keep exploring these ideas. Revisit the Stanford Encyclopedia entry, check out some of the philosophers we've talked about. And as you go about your day, think about what aspect of personal identity you find most important for grounding our ethical obligations. It's a question worth pondering.